Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you. Hope your week has gone absolutely great. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And goodness, good coffee this morning. Okay, reminder, what are we doing? We're looking at Romans chapter 8 in comparison with 1 Corinthians 15. Paul's doctrine of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 is Paul's doctrine of the body and life and resurrection in Romans chapter 8. However, as we have shown, Paul's doctrine of the body, Paul's doctrine of the flesh, Paul's doctrine of resurrection in Romans chapter 8 absolutely is not dealing with physical flesh and blood. Paul in Romans chapter 8 says, those who are in the flesh cannot be pleasing to God. Well, if he's talking about biological flesh, then that means you and I, no matter how much we love the Lord, no matter how much we want to be with Him, we can't please Him, period. Because after all, we're in flesh. But that's directly parallel to 1 Corinthians 15, 50 through 52, where Paul said, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom. Directly parallel passages. Now, since Paul said if you're in the flesh, you cannot please God, and flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God or enter the kingdom of God, but Paul's discussion of flesh in Romans 8 has nothing to do with biological bodies. What does that mean in 1 Corinthians 15? It means that Paul is not talking about the transformation of biological human bodies in order to enter heaven. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom. Directly parallel passages, but in the flesh in Romans is not biological flesh. Therefore, when Paul says flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom, he is not saying you have to put off a biologically flesh body in order to enter the kingdom, which, by the way, would kind of mess up the traditional view anyway that says, oh, wait, we got to have a physical resurrection. Okay, if we have to have physical resurrection in order to go to heaven, then we have to have a physical resurrection of that which cannot enter heaven. Paul says flesh and blood does not enter heaven. And people say, well, okay, it's transformed. Okay, that's fine. What is Paul talking about in Romans 8? What is he talking about in 1 Corinthians 15 when he says to put off the mind of flesh? Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Well, wait a minute. The mind is that which was either a mind of flesh or a mind of the Spirit. And thus Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, let's remember to go back over what I shared with you in the last video. Just like Paul in Romans chapter 8 says if you're in the flesh you cannot be pleasing to God, pardon me, and just like Paul said flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom, just like Paul urged the Romans to put off the mind of flesh, Paul said, we have borne, aorist, active indicative, again, if memory serves me correctly, as we have borne the image of the earthly, let us, it's in the subjunctive mode, folks, in the Greek, in the majority of texts. Now, the subjunctive means that Paul was saying to the Corinthians, it was their responsibility to put on the image of the heavenly. That's directly parallel to Romans chapter 8. Put off the mind of flesh, put on the mind of the Spirit. You've borne, pardon me, you've borne the image of the earthly, of the man of the dust. Now, put on the image of the heavenly. But once again, Paul's not dealing with biological bodies. And that is driven home, once again, when Paul says, Romans 8 verse 9. You are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. I cannot overemphasize enough that Paul's statement here is a direct contradiction of the traditional view of flesh, of the necessity for a physical resurrection. Paul says, no, you have to put off the flesh. But he's not saying you have to put off your physical body. He was saying you have to stop living according to the flesh. You have to stop living a life contrary to the will of God. You have to stop living your lives dedicated in submission to, devoted to sin, the sting of death. Put off sin. Because when you deal with sin, you deal with death. And thus you're not in the flesh. You are in the Spirit if the Spirit of Christ dwells in you. You see, having the mind of Christ which was a mind of obedience and submission and the love of God, the love of everything righteous and holy and pure. Philippians chapter 4, 6 and following. That mind of obedience and submission and holiness and righteousness, that mind is the life, and it is the mind of the Spirit versus the life of the flesh. Listen, pardon me. If you want a real easy to read explanation of a lot of these concepts, you need to get the book, The Last Enemy and the Triumph of Christ by Daniel Rogers. I've told you about this book before. I tell you what, folks, it's so easy to read. It is so easy to understand. You know, a lot of people say, boy, you know, Don, the resurrection is so difficult. Look, if you want a Reader's Digest version, okay, it's not simplistic, but it's easy to read and easy to understand. Again, the book is The Last Enemy and the Triumph of Christ. Go to my website, donkpreston.com or bibleprophecy.com, and order the book. Sorry I can't offer free shipping on this book because shipping, you know, is so expensive these days. But the point of fact is, you will absolutely love this book. You will see how Daniel Rogers has an ability to take some complex ideas and to bring them down, to condense them down to where you're going, oh, wow, yeah, I see that. You'll love the book. So again, go to donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and order the book today. You will be absolutely glad that you did. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. Hope you have an absolutely fantastic weekend. Lord willing, we'll see you on Monday.